So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Claire Scantleberry and I'm the Director General of EuropaBio, and I will be guiding you through our webinar this afternoon, which is dedicated to our biomanufacturing platform within EuropaBio and the outcomes from our first hosted Biomanufacturing Summit 2023. Thank you all so much for joining us, and we hope that you'll be very interactive in the next hour and a little bit. So if you can have the next slide, please. So it's my job to give you the small introduction and overview. I've already introduced myself, and I'm now going to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, so it will be available afterwards. And we would really love you to be involved as well, to bring your voice to the discussion this afternoon, and really either use the chat function or get involved, ask questions, and we will have a session at the end of the webinar where we can ask your questions. So if we can have the next slide, please. So we have a short but sweet agenda this afternoon. After my introduction, I'm going to hand over to Virginia, who will present the recommendations that emerged from our Biomanufacturing Policy Summit. Before we have perspectives and reflections from 3 of our industry advisory group members that support our industrial biomanufacturing, that support our biomanufacturing platform. We will have Sarah from Novartis, we have Gwenelle from Abolis, and we will have Inga from Lithuania Bio. We will then leave 15 or 20 minutes for a discussion and Q&A with the audience, and we very much look forward to undertaking all of your comments with us to add into the final report and in the outcomes from this webinar. So we can have the next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a tiny introduction to EuropaBio. As many of you will know, we are the Industry Association for Biotechnology, and we are active across sectors. And we work to help build the right legislative and regulatory framework in which biotechnology can grow and flourish. And of course, we don't do this just from a European perspective, because Europe sits within a very fast-changing world, as we're all hugely aware now. So as biotechnology and biomanufacturing becomes a technology for the future, and it becomes integrated into so many more aspects of our lives, the rest of the world is also moving. And it's very important that Europe knows what it has, where it should go, and how it should get there. Because we know in EuropaBio that where we work across all of our different sectors, we know that we have to help deliver biotech innovations through to all citizens across sectors. We need to ensure that it can gain enough investment to really deliver and mature next generation technologies. And of course, reinforce the excellence of science that Europe has at its very heart across science and society. And members are at the very heart of our biomanufacturing platform, and indeed all of EuropaBio. We have company members from startup through to large international companies. We have national associations, and we have expert members that really enable companies to deliver their biotechnology. So as we often say in EuropaBio, we want to deliver healthy people, a healthy planet, and underpinning that, healthy economies. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a really small introduction to the biomanufacturing platform. This is something that's been developing for quite some time within EuropaBio, because we realize, and indeed we all realize, that Europe is very much at an industrial, societal, and environmental threshold right now. And it's also at a legislative threshold. Many factors are coming together that create the necessity for a platform such as our biomanufacturing one. And we wanted to see within EuropaBio, whereas biotechnology has been an enabling technology for a very long time. And often you don't see what it produces because the products are not directly tied with biotechnology. And that means you have to go to lots of different sectors to see what it's doing and to understand the impact that it has. So by building the biomanufacturing platform, particularly linked to policy within EuropaBio, we want to help bring it together from across all sectors and say, this is what biomanufacturing is. This is the role it already plays within Europe's development, within its societal growth, within its economic growth, within its employment, within its skills development. And so that really underpinned what we wanted to do with the biomanufacturing platform. So it has a mission, as you see here, to represent biomanufacturing at the highest policy levels and ensure that it is visible and recognised and integrated into industrial strategy. We also want to make sure that the wider policy and wider frameworks are right for biomanufacturing, because they all make a difference, as in people who work in all advanced technologies understand it's a complex framework of legislation in which technologies must mature, and it's no different for biomanufacturing. It's really important that these are all right. So through our platform, we're going to address how economic growth, employment, and resilience can be achieved, and indeed see where biomanufacturing already delivers these types of activities. And so we will work across all areas that impact biomanufacturing to ensure that policymakers and other stakeholders and wider society understand and recognise the role that biomanufacturing plays. The biomanufacturing platform is quite new. We just started it late last year, and our ambition for the first year is to ensure that we are visible, that biomanufacturing is seen and recognised and understood. And all of our members are involved, because we already have the Healthcare Council, an Industrial Biotech Council, and a National Associations Council. And from there, all of our members are involved, so the companies and indeed also our SME platform, because of course, a critical part of successful biomanufacturing is the growth of innovative young companies that bring through the disruptive and advanced technologies that will become common everywhere. Next slide, please. Before we can talk about biomanufacturing and bring everybody with us, we have to say what it is. Because as we know, there's a huge number of words and phrases that are used to describe biotechnology and what it does. And it's very important that we pull these together as well and say, all of this constitutes biomanufacturing. And there's various different definitions around, but we wanted to start developing a definition that is simple and accessible. The text you see on the screen before you is the starting point of something that we've already been working on with members. And I think by the time we had our summit in March, we'd already gone through at least 15 different development phases of even this simple language. So we're going to continue to develop this up and ensure that it can underpin with lots of examples, lots of our members bringing their own stories into the scenario, so that people everywhere can understand what biomanufacturing achieves and what enables it to take place. Next slide, please. So this webinar is linked very closely to our first Biomanufacturing Summit that we held in March this year in Brussels, where we had all of our members and lots of different stakeholders from across the Brussels landscape coming together and discussing what is important for biomanufacturing. So within this meeting, we set the context for biomanufacturing in Europe. We looked at how important it was, and that includes very much the global context here. As we know, of course, that the White House recently published an executive order on biomanufacturing, and that territories and countries such as China have very advanced biomanufacturing strategies themselves. So it was very important to understand where Europe sits within the global story. Then we looked at some amazing examples of biomanufacturing, and these are incredibly diverse, and we will be publishing these and showcasing them as we go through the year. Then our members work together to say, what are the priorities, both in advanced healthcare, but also for resilience, sustainability, and competitiveness, because this changes everywhere in all sectors across Europe. And finally, we close the summit with a look at Europe's ambitions going forward. What do we need to achieve, and how bold should we be? So as we come here today for this webinar, we're going to look at the recommendations for Europe that came out of the Biomanufacturing Summit. Next week, we will publish the full summit report, and then we will be in action, helping put these recommendations into reality. And so that really brings me to the next phase of our webinar, where I'm delighted to welcome Virginia, who is going to present the recommendations that came out of the summit in March. Thank you very much, Virginia.
So thank you, Claire, and welcome everybody. So indeed, during this section of the webinar, I will present the key recommendations that the EuropaBio distilled from the discussions of the summit. And they are primarily cross-sectoral, reflecting the roles and significance of biomanufacturing in almost all sectors. Next, please. Before I go through them one by one, I'd like to emphasize that we should be proud of Europe being at the forefront of innovation, and we should always aspire to be there. And it's now time to put biomanufacturing high on the agenda and create a formal cross-sectoral roadmap that reflects European strategy at the highest level and importantly across sectors. So next, please. The first recommendation is a priority. It is time to keep up pace with the rest of the world and acknowledge the key role of biomanufacturing in remaining globally competitive, achieving resilience and strategic autonomy. The second recommendation reminds us that, as with every serious roadmap, Europe must set targets for the increase of biomanufacturing within the European economy. It will be complex, but it's essential, especially with significant legislations being developed right now. As I mentioned, we are proud in Europe to innovate, and we witness many great initiatives in R&D funding. With recommendation number 3, we indicate that it is time to coordinate more closely and be coherent between R&D focused initiatives, industry priorities, and commercial deployment so that priority technologies have a clear path to maturity. Ultimately, it's when bio-based processes and products hit the market that we can applaud the success of biomanufacturing. Recommendation 4 emphasizes that for this to happen, Europe must improve the funding mechanisms and the enabling policies to support the uptake of R&D results into value-added business and economic development. Recommendation 5 recalls the strong power of legislation. Pathways for biomanufacturing can often cross several legislative frameworks, and it is critical that these frameworks do not create conflicting or diverging pressures. This has a dampening effect on innovation, especially for smaller companies who are less able to foresee or afford problems. And regulations are also really important to ensure safety, quality, respect for the environment, but they are often slow and inadequate with the speed of scientific and industrial development. Recommendation 6 emphasizes that in the biomanufacturing context, it's important to design regulations that increase agility and accelerate Europe's industrial transition, putting focus on product-driven rather than process-driven criteria. This allows us to safely harness technologies to transition manufacture of existing products. Recommendation 7 speaks of another very important topic, that is resilience. Europe must recognize the improvement in resilience and agility that results from biomanufacturing capacity and skills. Healthcare preparedness and supply chain resilience don't appear only when you most need them. We need to ensure that they are already there through an industrial environment in Europe that enables their business. And as we all know, startups and SMEs represent an extremely large and important part of the fabric of the European economy. Next, please. And we must recognize their innovative work in biotechnology and biomanufacturing. They represent our future, but often, as we know, they lack the capex to scale as companies, but also as manufacturing agents. And we must incentivize more collaborations with bigger players and more investments in these young, innovative companies. Recommendation 9 speaks of skills and employment. With expanding innovative sectors come expanding employment needs, possibilities, and new requirements. Biomanufacturing is boosted by advanced automation and by the Industry 5.0 roadmap. And Europe needs to support the creation of skills pathway for biomanufacturing to soften the war for talent and ensure access to critical reskilling and upskilling in all European countries. And last but not least, Europe shall ensure a global level playing field for transition to sustainable manufacturing processes and products as part of the Green Deal. And we've recently took note of the carbon border adjustment mechanism that is a relevant action on this front. And we hope to see also incentives towards environmental friendly biomanufactured goods and processes. Thank you. And the word goes back to Claire.
Thank you very much. And in fact, we were way too efficient there. So we used precisely half of the time we gave ourselves to present our recommendations. But you can see there that lots of these calls are not unusual, perhaps, because we see them quite regularly. But for biomanufacturing, it's incredibly important that we reach that little bit further to bring them together, because it's not an ecosystem in its own right as part of the industrial strategy, but sits across multiple ecosystems. So often you will find the language a little bit different, the data is recorded slightly differently, as biomanufacturing is manifested in lots of different market sectors. So it's incredibly important that we bring a focus and a recognition to it. And indeed, EuropaBio is part of the European Commission's Industrial Forum, and more specifically part of the Task Force 5 on advanced manufacturing, where we're working together with other associations to present biomanufacturing as part of one of the key requirements for Europe to be able to meet the very ambitious goals that it sets itself. Because we all want Europe to reach those goals, but what we need to enable it to do is use the tools and unlock the tools to be able to do that. So I'm really happy now to have 3 of our members here to give an initial feedback to the recommendations that came from the summit. So I would really like to invite Sarah to introduce herself first, and we will see how Novartis and Sarah would respond to the recommendations from a healthcare perspective. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks a lot, Claire, and good afternoon, everyone. First of all, a huge thank you to EuropaBio for the opportunity to speak, and also a huge thank you to the team, to Virginia and Francisco, for the excellent coordination. You can go to the 2 next slides, one more. My name is Sarah Mundir, and I'm a EU Public Affairs Senior Manager at Novartis. Novartis is a Switzerland-based and headquartered company with a very strong footprint in Europe, and also a broad portfolio. So we do have biological treatments such as cell and gene therapies, but we also have cancer treatments and also a strong focus on cardiovascular diseases. And you can go to the next slide. So I'm happy to represent the healthcare sector and give some perspectives and reflections on the report, but also in general what's needed to have a competitive and prosperous biomanufacturing sector in Europe. I will zoom out a bit and first talk about the general challenges for the sector. And you might have seen in the press yesterday, the European Commission published its long-awaited proposal on the pharmaceutical legislation, so a regulation and a directive. And there, the challenge was to find a balance between, on the one hand, industry's competitiveness, and on the other hand, the uptake of innovation, so access to medicines, because we know that we live in a globalized world, and other regions such as the US and China are also trying everything to support their industry. So we know how important the competitiveness of the industry is for jobs, for employment. But then, of course, the medicines have to reach the patients. So the uptake of innovation for us is access to medicines. And this is a balance, a difficult balance to strike. And you can go to the next slide. I will go through 2.5 of the recommendations. The first one is the point on legislation and the need to align the legislations to address unintentional barriers. And something that we have seen in the past, and it's linked to the point I mentioned before, this balance between industrial competitiveness and access. So there is the pharmaceutical strategy that has been published a few years ago, mainly led by DG Santé, with the main focus on access, availability, affordability, which is, of course, really, really important. But on the other hand, we also have the industrial strategy, mostly led by DG GROW, and sometimes these two are a bit contradicting each other. So we think it's really important that they are better aligned and complementary to each other. That's just one example. And then on the 7th point, recognizing Europe's resilience, improvement coming from biomanufacturing capacity in Europe. So one example that we all know from the last years is the COVID-19 response, how Europe has been able to be a leader in the response. So we have the European manufacturers of vaccines that managed to bring these treatments in amazing speed to the market. And then we also had a lot of European companies supporting that. So for instance, us as Novartis, we don't have a vaccine manufacturing business unit. However, we had experts in our company on mRNA for cancer treatments and others. And we managed to then free up some of the lines to support the manufacturing of the vaccine in Austria, in Slovenia, in Switzerland. So that really shows how important it is, as Claire mentioned, to have a resilient EU base before the crisis happens, and so that we can be ready and leaders. And we hope that this will remain like that in the coming years. And I have, because it's not part of the 10 recommendations, but it's also a really important point for us. And it's the competitiveness profile of EU biomanufacturing. And during the summit, my colleague had a really good presentation with a lot of data points on the difference between Europe versus US versus China versus other geographies. How are we doing across all the elements of the value chain? So how are we doing on the funding, on the public and private funding, venture capital, for instance? How are we doing in the translation of research? So we have good universities, but can we translate that research into treatments? Then how fast do we approve medicines in Europe? So the difference between the EMA and then the FDA and other regulatory agencies. And then, of course, the last element of the value chain, which is, of course, the access. So do we manage to bring the medicine to the patients that need it, and how quickly in the different geographies and also within Europe? So these were the highlights. And then to wrap up, you can go to the next slide. I was also asked to share what should Europe achieve or target. And I split it into 3 pillars. So as mentioned, we have now pharmaceutical legislation on the table, and it's really important that we ensure predictability of the regulatory and the IP framework. And especially for biotech, it was really important to have this update of the legislation that was 20 years old. And we've seen so much technological advances in the last decades, and many more to come. So the legislative framework needs to be future-proof, and we are, it's really important to work on having future-proof legislation. There are a lot of really good points already, and some that we are ready to work on with the policymakers. Then the second pillar is the ecosystem. So I'm convinced that it's really important for Europe to have this strong ecosystem that goes from academia and early research to the startups that Virginia mentioned, and SMEs that are the backbone of the European economy. Then to have the bigger pharmaceutical companies that are that have the means to conduct the trials, and to take the risk and bring the medicines to the market with some failures, of course, but that's are capable of doing these trials. And then, of course, also at the end of the value chain, the generics to make the systems more sustainable. So I think this whole ecosystem is so important, to have this healthy ecosystem and to work together to be, because we are all complementary to each other. And the last point, I mentioned it already, medicines are only helpful if they reach the patients, if we can make sure that innovation is translated into consumption, and in our case, it's access to medicines for the patients. Yeah, there are a lot of hurdles of access. We know it, I think we should definitely all together, all actors of this ecosystem should work together to make sure that this translation happens, and this will for sure be a positive thing for Europe. So that's it from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You made a lot of really good points in there, and particularly around the ecosystem, because of course, biomanufacturing capacity does not exist because somebody presses a button. It's only there because we know that we can either generate or biomanufacture medicines that are going to reach the patients. And it's only there because when you look at the really strong sort of the contract layer in Europe as well for biomanufacturing, which played a key role in the COVID response as well, that's only there because they think there's going to be a market for what they produce. And because Europe had amazing capacity to respond to the COVID crisis, it doesn't mean to say it will always have that capacity. We must always make sure that there is the business model in place to allow those huge investments to be put into place. So thank you very much indeed, Sarah. That was extremely helpful from the sort of the healthcare perspective, because it's such a critical part of biomanufacturing. Thank you. Okay, so we will move to our next speaker now, and I'm very happy to introduce Gwenaëlle from Abolis, one of our industrial biotechnology members. So Gwenaëlle, I will hand over to you for your response to the recommendations.
Thank you, Claire. So I will start, if you can go on the next slide, by a short introduction about Abolis and a little bit about myself. So I'm a chemist by training. I've been making, let's say, classical organic chemistry so far, and I moved to biotechnology a couple of years ago after a long experience of 20 years in pharma. And I thought it was time to switch to something, let's say, more global regarding the different producing methods. So I'm working for Abolis. Next slide, please. And so Abolis is less well known than Novartis, obviously. So just a short introduction, and I will not be long. So it's a 54 people company founded 9 years ago, and we have built a strain development platform, and we are based in Paris, France. And we build strategic partnerships with world leaders in different domains, pharma, nutrition, and fine chemicals, so that we can develop alternative processes based on microbes to be able to deliver something which is more sustainable in terms of production methods. Next slide, please. During the couple of minutes that will follow, I will focus more on the 2 recommendations that are written here. So first one is to recognize the cross-sectoral biomanufacturing within high-level European strategies. And the second one would be to, just like Sarah, because I guess that this is a center point, to address the alignment across legislation, to address unintentional barriers to biomanufacturing scale-up for Europe. So it will be, let's say, the background of the discussion for the coming slides. And I will not focus specifically on 1 or 2 of those 2 points, but they will stay in the mind. Next, please. So biomanufacturing brings an important contribution to support the transition to the bioeconomy and the resilience of supply chains. It concerns many sectors, if not all of them. From health, as presented by Sarah just a little bit earlier, food, chemicals, materials, and fuels. But those are the global markets. On this slide, you can see a global representation. There are plenty of them. But this one shows the different connections and interactions between the different stakeholders. So if you consider the full supply chain, you have to think also about the feedstock at the beginning of the chain, obviously. And in our case, let's say for biomanufacturing, it could come from waste, biomass, and biomass, it's crop, forest, grassland, and so on. And at the other end of the chain, you have the disposal part, and you can imagine to recycle the waste for future use. If you add the processing part, I mean, the factories in between, because at the end of the day, you need to transform those raw materials to intermediates and to final products for customers. You can easily see that many sectors, which are quite different one from another, are involved. The variety of sectors goes from farming, transportation, end users, industry. So we said chemicals, pharma, food, feed, materials. I can't list all of them. And moving to a more sustainable economy can't be done without the support of policymakers and regulators, as we need to have a global view on sectors and ecosystems. It has to be globally considered. That is why EU needs to add biomanufacturing in its agenda, as Virginia was presented just a couple of minutes earlier. And we need to bring that at the strategic level, like the EU Green Deal. Most of you, I suppose, heard about that part. And also for the EU industrial strategy. So this is the only way that you can irrigate all the industry. Next slide, please. Another way to represent the different sectors impacted by biomanufacturing is to look at the time scale. For the most important and impactful one, it can go up to 10 plus years between the research phase and the industrialization. This kind of long-term view should be in line with a global industry policy at the higher level. The member state in EU, for example, and EU governance, obviously, because both are closely linked. The success will rely on long-term investment, but also, and it is very important for industry, on a visible and stable regulation. We can see here on the vertical side, which is on the left, that you will have also product replacements and raw material change. Those are directly in relation with the regulation and the authorization process. If you need to go through a long procedure to launch a new product, and this product has to be in line with the demand of the authorities to build a sustainable, to build them in a sustainable way, there are very few chances of success, and the companies will not take the risk to develop something new. In the same way, if you need to go through long and complex procedure to invest and build new factories, you may expose yourself to the competition. Could be from Asia, from the US, and we will get back a little bit later about the specific US situation. Next, please. So there are many numbers circulating around about the potential of biomanufacturing, but all of them are quite impressive. This representation here shows important figures across different sectors. We are here at the trillion level. It means that it will impact the global economy. Once again, it's another way to show that all the sectors are or will be concerned by industrial biotechnologies, and there is no other way to succeed than to have a smart regulation being connected between all the stakeholders. You can't dissociate a regulation in the farming sector from a regulation for the end customers or the industrial sectors. Otherwise, you take the risk to put in danger some important part of the supply chain. So it's obviously complex, and that is another reason to consider it at the highest level of governance, meaning strategic level of EU future coming. One last thing about this slide and the market numbers is the situation in the US. So Sarah and Claire were talking about that earlier. Most of you are aware of the biomanufacturing plan voted last year and developed earlier this year. It has been pushed and starting to be implemented this year. It is coupled with the IRA, which is the Inflation Reduction Act, and it will include everything from R&D to scale up and finally the production. Well, so far, R&D is doing quite well in EU. It's a very positive thing. And even the US envy our research. So it's not rare that to see US companies investing in our countries for R&D and then using it to produce in other places to get most of the value. So the question is, do we want to be the R&D lab of the world? The US are happy to capture the value behind the industrialization and production, mostly because of shorter time of implementation and a smarter regulation. We never say less regulation. That's why I prefer to use the word of smarter regulation, because we need to have regulation, but it has to be really adapted to what is the target you are looking for. So there are already several important European companies planning to invest in the US for production instead of Europe. So it means that the will and envy to move to industrial biotechnologies and more sustainable economy exist. We just need to make it happen here in Europe. We have all we need in Europe, and I'm really convinced of that. So we have all we need to make biomanufacturing a success, but we have to be smart and agile for the implementation. So all the cards are in our hands. And I will end on this one. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Gwenelle. And it's amazing how the points made for one particular application spread, in fact, are relevant to all of them. And we had a very good point made during the summit itself, saying it's no good just pushing innovation forward in a big way. The systems through which the innovation must travel, i.e. the regulatory systems, must be able to actually manage them, because otherwise you don't get more out of the other end. And this is something, you know, as we face with NGT legislation, as we face with pharma legislation right now, this is something that is in our hands to help achieve. You know, the science is never the bottleneck. Yeah. It's our job to help bring brilliant science through to society. So thank you very much indeed, Gwenelle. So we're going to move to our third participant now, who is Inga from EuropaBio. And it's a really nice opportunity to bring the National Association perspective, because of course, this is where a lot of the building happens on the ground, quite literally, in terms of enabling new infrastructure, building skills, ensuring internationalization. So our national associations in EuropaBio are absolutely central to understanding how this translates into economic actuality on the ground in each country in Europe. So Inga, please take it away.
Thank you, Claire, for your presentation. Can we go to next slide, please? Yeah, so I just shortly want to start with a short introduction about the association, formerly known as Lithuanian Biotechnology Association. The association actually represents the companies, research and study institutions, healthcare institutions, and NGOs. And on the national level, promotes the wide application of life sciences and biotechnology in the Lithuanian economy, and also as well trying to integrate it on the global scale. With currently we have 42 companies, member companies, 8 academia members, and almost 70 personal members. And the main and strong focus are on life sciences, health technologies, and bioeconomy. And association as well is a member of the global organizations like EuropaBio. This is the reason why we're here as well, ScanBalt organization, HCH Alliance, Alliance for Regenerative Medicine, and Biobase Consortium. And by that, I just would like you to take a little bit deeply on our national Lithuanian landscape. Actually, we have quite mature life sciences and biotechnology ecosystem with almost 98,000 employees in the subsectors like biotechnology, pharma, industrial biotechnology, medical devices, and with more than 60 life sciences startups. The numbers of our national landscape in these sectors are also quite good. We are quite proud of them. It's like the sector's export intensity reached almost 92% in 2021, with main export countries like US, Germany, Poland, Switzerland, and UK. And the sector's revenue in 2021 reached almost 2.7 billion euro and recorded a fantastic 170% of growth over the last 2 years. Of course, it's also due to the reason that we had the capacities, and also we had the competencies and some companies working on that, and we were involved actually in the full control on COVID situation. And also over the last decade, Lithuanian biotech sector recorded almost 11-fold growth. And for now, actually, it is one of the highest value added sector on the national economy. There is a question, what is the reasons behind such company success? But actually, to answering this question, we have to look a little bit into the history. Actually, in Lithuania, the history of biotech and life sciences started in late 70s when the Institute of Applied Enzymology was established. And from this institute, together with our independence, such spin-off companies were allocated, like Biofa, later Secor Biotech, with the technologies on the growth hormone production. And later they were acquired by the Teva, another spin-off company like Fermentus, with the production of molecular tools for gene engineering, were in 2010 acquired by Thermo Fisher Scientific. And currently we also have some the breakthrough technologies with the local know-how CRISPR technologies with the lead of Professor Virginijus Šikšnys, and with the Partnership Institute of Amble Lab and startup companies such as the Kazime. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Yeah, with such landscape on the national level, actually the government several years ago set really quite high ambition. The strategic goal to generate like 5% of Lithuania's GDP by 2020. By 2030, in 2020, we had 2.5%. And actually biomanufacturing can be one of the ways to reach such goal. And the complete ecosystem in biomanufacturing requires like the four main players, like infrastructure, funding, regulation, and people. And currently with this goal as well, we on the national level, we face a new set of the challenges, because it's very important to understand and to integrate the entire sector with such expanding, as well to align the expectations of all the stakeholders with a long-term and short-term goals. Also to find the supportive financial mechanisms to reach this goal, and other smaller challenges as well. So within the recommendations provided by EuropaBio, actually, we could take all 10, but then because all 10 are important for the development of Lithuanian biotechnology and life science system, and also especially in the biomanufacturing area. And but currently for this presentation, we just choose the 2 of them. Next slide, please. So the most important currently, we indicated that not only with the set of vision and the goal with the regulations on manufacturing on EU level, but also for us on the national level, it would be very important to ensure the investment into startups and SMEs to scale up biomanufacturing. On the national level, we have very scattered funding programs. As well, to boost the biomanufacturing, we need also the national strategy and also some programs, or to have the vision, you know, how to scale up biomanufacturing, especially the transition from the startups to SMEs and from SMEs to large enterprises. As well, we think that the lack of sector-specific grants also limits some growth of the sector. As well as already was talked a lot about the regulation system, but for sure we have one indicated one very important point as well, that for example, we don't have any pilot plans in the Baltics. We don't say that only in Lithuania, but also in the whole Baltic countries, which are quite important, you know, to boost the development of technologies from the fundamental phases to the application and also to the production level. And one more recommendation, which we indicated as very important, especially now to start with, it's to create a skills pathway for biomanufacturing and advanced manufacturing. We think that it's very important, and probably it's as early as we start to work on this recommendation, we will see the results in the future, which are very important. And for sure, we really need to rethink and to refocus the study programs to put more direction on manufacturing, on bioprocess, gene editing applications, because in Lithuania we have 7 universities, 7 colleges on life sciences and biotechnology, which are providing over 800 graduates and postgraduates annually. As well, the targeted training programs in biomanufacturing is very important. The investment in the teaching staff, also the industry training for real world application, let's say, and also focusing especially on the missing competencies, practical training, certification of specialists. All this is also very important. So by that, I just would like just one more time to indicate that these recommendations, what was highlighted by EuropaBio, especially when we see when we see on the national level, they are really very important, because if it will be set one vision, one goal, and one roadmap actually for the positioning and the targets in Europe, as well in Lithuania, we will have the value, and also for us as well will be to acquire everything on the national level much more easier. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Inga. And I think it's really, the examples you gave were really good, especially when you talked about the sort of value added aspect of it, because I think for me, biomanufacturing across all sectors represents Europe's true vision of a knowledge driven economy. You know, because you look at the high value of the materials that are developed, you look at the high skills required to do this. And for healthcare, this is enabling us to access entirely new disease areas in new ways. So it really pushes medicine forward. And on the sort of climate change sustainability side, this is the critical industrial transition. And so Europe has to make this transition in order to stay competitive, because the rest of the world is already starting to make this transition. So it's not a nice to have for Europe to move towards these types of biomanufacturing, to move from sort of traditional into biomanufacturing processes. It's a must have. And we see these in countries like Lithuania, where this is your economic footprint at a national level. So it's fantastic to see the growth that's happened in Lithuania. And of course, we should, of course, say we were in Lithuania last year for our EFIB conference, where we could see all your amazing biomanufacturing in action directly. So thanks very much indeed, Inge. So we now come to the point where we're going to have a slightly wide discussion with the audience, and I would really encourage you to add your questions into the chat. We already have some very nice questions, which is very good. But I wanted to start, before we went, to look at the result of a little LinkedIn poll that we ran in the last week, where we asked people, what is the biggest challenge to advanced manufacturing in Europe? And regulatory barriers were by the hands down winner here. And it's interesting for me that people said the lack of R&I funding is the lowest priority, because of course Europe's really good at that. It's traditionally put a lot of money into research and innovation. And as I said to Ganel, the science is never the bottleneck. We can always respond with amazing science to different challenges. And the regulatory barriers represent what creates the bottleneck to a lot of the other things. So for example, scale-up funding. Once you've got the regulations in place and innovation can see its route forward to the market, you then have a market pull for the products and the processes that you can develop, which means that you will find more funding coming in. You will find companies in particular investing into expansion and skills development. And so it's not just the public push of technologies forward, it's the market pull back that makes a huge difference. And the thing that makes the difference there are the regulatory barriers. So we'd really like to thank everybody that took part in the poll, and it was very helpful to do. And you can expect more things like this from the biomanufacturing platform, as we particularly look at how we implement the recommendations. So I'm going to go to the next slide now, which just summarizes the recommendations here. And I'm going to start looking at the very nice questions that we have in the chat. Very first one came from Raphael, and I think Sarah's going to take that, and I will read it out. It says, we have a question regarding the global architecture system explained by Sarah, which includes R&D, university, big pharma, etc. In this architecture, how do you see the environmental sustainability topic, and how, if this topic will impact the price of access for medicines? So Sarah, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, thanks, Claire, and thank you, Raffaele, also for the question. So yes, it's true that in the last decades we have seen quite a shift and an offshoring of production, mostly to Asia, and but it's mostly for the generic market, where the price pressure was so high. And because the EU has such high standards on environmental sustainability compared to other regions, but we fully support a level playing field. So we believe that the standards should be as high as in Europe, also in other geographies. And we have seen also a focus on environmental sustainability topics in the general pharma legislation, but also in the staff working documents written by DG GROW that came out of the structured dialogue on security of supply. So it is a topic that is being discussed at EU level extensively. And just the link then to price, I think that for innovative medicines, and for a company like Novartis, we have really ambitious targets on environmental sustainability, and there I don't think that that will have an impact on the price. However, for generic medicines, because still until this summer, Novartis has a business unit, Sandoz, which is a generic company, and there we have been asking for smart procurement, which means that generics are usually purchased via tender systems, and tenders were only based on the price. So then, of course, a European company cannot compete with a company that is based in Asia. However, if the criteria include also environmental sustainability, security of supply, then the European company can compete, and that might have then an impact on the price. But thanks a lot for the question.
It's a really interesting question, and I think it touches at least two of our recommendations when it talks about, global level playing field, because we want Europe to have great environmental standards. We all need good environmental standards, regardless of which bit of the world they might be taking on. So that was one of the recommendations there. But I think it's really interesting on the fact that sustainability is already being priced into medicines as well. So, because I know some of our other members have got their ability to be sustainable was one of their key capabilities of opening up in Europe. So it's Europe needs to use this wisely. And the smart procurement question is another really good one, because I think one of our other key recommendations, and that was not allowing different frameworks to pull in opposite directions on the answer that we want. The smart procurement question fits right in there, because if tenders are only considered based on price, you then can't push new technologies or more sustainable technologies through. And that's a really obvious example of that. So thank you. We now have another question. And this is super tricky for all of our three panelists, so I will immediately ask it to you. What are the top three most urgent changes Europe should introduce to fully release the potential of European biomanufacturing? So thank you for that, Wojciech. Which one of our panelists would like to answer that first? And perhaps we'd be super happy with one urgent change rather than your each top three. Who would like to take this one first? Gwenelle, you have unmuted.
No, so it's definitely a good question, because, if you've got a long list of recommendations and a long list of action to do, at the end of the day, you never do anything. So you have to focus on one or two important things. And so what is let's say the most important is definitely, we were talking about the regulation. And if you look at the question just below, it's exactly the same point. It means that why is it so difficult in Europe to launch a new product? Not just in healthcare, in very different fields. It could be nutrition, it could be cosmetics, it could be wherever you want. Why is it so difficult to launch something new in Europe? Because most of the time, and it's exactly the first point of the next question is, policy should be technology agnostic. And sometimes we say, okay, we don't want nuclear, we don't want GMOs, we don't want that. But this is not the point. The technology is not the point. What is the value? What is the risk? And what is what you can bring good for the different countries? It could be for the people, the employment, the investment, and those are high value technologies. So it will bring back, let's say, at the end of the day, more value that we can get back to the population afterwards. So the focus will be, if I need to get back to one point, is definitely to be agnostic on the technology, definitely, and to have a regulation that is really in relation with the reality of the demand. Otherwise, it will be very simple. The US and Asia will win the game, and we will be the R&D lab. And this is something, we are good at it. There is almost no issues by funding the R&D in Europe, European level, or even of the national level. You've got many, many initiatives, and it's working very, very well. But when we need to go further, it's much simpler and much quicker for the scale-up and the industrialization to go in other countries. So definitely to work on the regulation based on the product instead of really the technology by itself.
No, thanks very much, Gwen. Now, that reminds me of another great quote from the summit where somebody said Europe needs to be the pilot of the plane rather than the passenger, which was a really good phrase. And again, it's entirely in our hands to do. So perhaps I will pick on Inga as well to say, from Lithuania's perspective, which one of these recommendations would you want to implement most critically?
Most critically, actually, yeah, it's the most critically what I was discussing so far, according to our current needs, what I was introducing. But for sure, regulations. It's like what Sarah and Gwenal told, because if we have some barriers, with regulations, we can do whatever we want, but the startups not going to grow. Also, the technologies will not be developed in this area where regulations are, they are restricted by regulations, So then it's like we're losing some technologies which are really important. And it's probably not only on the national level, but also on the EU level, and with CRISPR technologies as well. We have some issues with the regulations as well. It's like it's genetically modified or not, and it's like still is going on the discussions, yeah. And probably we also with the regulation probably also we have to put more input of not only the society awareness about the GMO and all this, because as the scientists we understand what it is, at what it can cause. But also maybe we need to highlight this awareness also on the governmental level, on EU level, on the talking with our commission's representatives also in the Brussels as well. It's like so education probably is also quite on needs to go in parallel with everything else what we're trying to achieve.
Thanks indeed very much. Thanks very much, Inga. And in fact, I remember the conversation about GM starting back in my PhD days, which was a really long time ago. So it's disappointing to know it's still going on. But Sarah, what would your most urgent change be to make today?
So to complement Gwenal and Inga, and also to come back on one of my points before, I think it's this healthy ecosystem to really work together. Every actor, stakeholder has a crucial role on this value chain, and instead of finger pointing and being showing how the others don't do it well enough, I think working together and being constructive, that's would be my first. Thank you.
Yes, always better together. So we've got a nice question coming up as well from Viola saying, and this is an interesting one because I think the question is, do you see in other regions the same problems? And of course, it's very easy when we sit in Europe to go, oh, it's much better somewhere else. But of course, all regions have their own challenges. So perhaps, would you like to respond to where you see the challenges, perhaps in the US, perhaps in Asia? I don't know if one of you would like to take that first.
Regarding the challenges in the US, so far, I mean, to be honest, with biomanufacturing, we will need to see how fast they will implement the new strategy. I mean, if they are doing what they plan to do, it will be very harmful, and I don't see any drawback on the current plan. The problem that we may face in the US is regarding maybe the IP, because if they've got the money, if they make the investment, for the R&D, even by buying European companies. And then if they've got the entire supply chain, I mean, the IP will belong to the US for the world. So one of the drawbacks could be if you've got nothing to put in front of that, you will lose, let's say the value. For Asia, it's difficult to say because you've got less figures and less information coming from China, basically, and we know that they are investing a lot in biomanufacturing also. So for them, it could be maybe the raw materials and the feedstocks. That could be something that could be, let's say, something more difficult for them, because in that part, if you need to implement your entire supply chain, you will need to, just like oil, you will need to have a resilient supply chain for that, and it should be an issue for them.
No, that's a really good point. Thank you. And the supply chains, we talk a lot about, strategic autonomy, but of course, supply chains are always global in the end. And this is something we saw during COVID. We saw it both in the supply of medicines and in the supply of food. We have globalized so much, and Europe as a trading bloc has been going, Europe has been trading internationally for thousands and thousands of years. This is not a recent phenomenon. So I guess that Europe needs to work to build resilient supply chains, but it's possibly a weak point for other regions. So I don't know if Inga and Sarah want to respond as well, or we can go to our next question. No, that's good. Let's go, because we've got a quick question here on bioprocessing equipment standards. So I think this would be an interesting one to ask, because of course, standardization is a tool to enable, to de-risk and bring down prices, when it is done strategically. I don't know if anybody would like to respond to this. Perhaps, Gwenelle, this may fall back near you again, given that you're working directly in the fermentation area.
It's a good point. I mean, to be honest, I do not have a definitive answer about that, because we were talking about the regulation, and the standardization could be also a barrier to the freedom to innovate sometimes. So we are still in the early phase, even if it's growing fast. All those industrial biotechnologies, I'm talking about the industrial scale. This is still, I'm not talking about bioethanol and the biofuel, which is quite different, but for advanced products, this is quite new, and standardization will come. It will be mandatory, I'm pretty sure, but the point is not to introduce it too soon. Otherwise, just like, let's say, the regulation that come at the wrong moment, it can kill, it can be a disadvantage, definitely. So yes, but at the right moment, for sure.
That's great. It sounds like that needs to feed into our recommendations as well. It's a balanced approach to enable more, to enable and de-risk areas for investment, but not to prevent further innovation in that area. Okay, so now we've still got questions coming in. Now we've got a really nice question, which is, what is the strategic added value of biomanufacturing with respect to the circular action plan and the bioeconomy strategy? I mean, we know, and again, this sort of slightly leans back towards Gwenelle to some extent, as it's more on the industrial biotech side. But I would say, one of the reasons we set up the biomanufacturing platform was so that we could make these very strong points to existing strategies and say, we don't see this being used inside the strategy, because you can't just achieve your goals by taking stuff out of the system. Most stuff was in there for a reason. And so when you take it out, you need to replace it with something else that has the same effect. So you can't achieve circularity or security of food supply by simply removing components of industries. I don't know, Gwenelle, I'm very sorry to come back to you again, but this is very specifically a bioeconomy and circular action question. I don't know if you have any comments on that. In fact, I think Gwenelle has just fallen out of the webinar because he looked like he just crashed. So, but I think this brings us perfectly to the end of our webinar, absolutely exquisitely on time. So I would like to thank everybody very much for their questions. And in fact, I tell a lie, because there is one more question that I saw in the Q&A, which is actually about skills development to support policy. So I'm going to ask the question, and perhaps I think, Sarah, you would be very well placed to answer this. It says, as a recent doctoral graduate, I'm very aware of the importance of regulation and policy work. How do you transition into a policy career? What specific education is required? So I think you could probably give us a great example from your own work.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I have a political scientist background, but I know that peers of mine have scientific backgrounds. They are lawyers. So I think we need all of these skills to, you know, lobby on behalf of our companies or in the trade association, and to speak to policymakers. So yeah, I think what I can tell you is, yeah, be open to different tasks. Don't go forcefully the path, the straight path, but be open to other opportunities. Have a broad network. Try to meet with lots of people, and then we are yeah, really happy. I mean, I'm always fascinated when there are people that work in public affairs but have a scientific background. I think it's great to work together and to have a complementary views.
Thanks very much. And I know a lot of the people, because when I even look into the EuropaBio office, there's only 2 of us that come from a scientific background, but others there's a lot of legal background within the office. But I think one common thing is that there's a lot of master's degrees that are available that you could do over 1 or 2 years that will bring you a sort of public affairs or European affairs or regulatory affairs mix or layer to your own knowledge as well. And it's a really interesting pathway to take, because you can see right from the scientific base right through to the tangled web that technology must travel through to reach a market. So there's lots of different courses available, and unsurprisingly, Brussels offers a lot of stuff like that in the universities here, both in person and online. So you would certainly be able to take an additional qualification to get a bit more of an insight.
And you learn by doing as well, right?
Absolutely. And I think, Sarah, working at a large company for you as well, you get lots of pathways open to you inside large companies. So you can go in doing one thing from a scientific perspective, but as Sarah said, take opportunities, seek them out, because you can grow layers of skills in a career like that. Inga, I don't know if you wanted to add any pearls of wisdom in there on career development also.
Yeah, it's just probably I'm a good example, you know, myself, I'm a chemist. With my studies, actually, with my elective courses, I almost finished biochemistry. And with gene engineering courses and so on. And my PhD already was in biochemistry as well. And now it's like I have a bunch. I'm working as a senior scientist at the university, and also I am vice-president of Lithuanian Biotechnology Association, or now Association Lithuania Bio. So I know how this, you know, multiple skills, but with a background of applied scientist really helps to sometimes foresee, you know, this technological implementation, scale ups, and also which technologies are reliable or not, and how reliable. So it helps really a lot. But I would say also vice versa, that with the political like science skills or whatever, people as well can, you know, also with the help of some courses, they also can gain skills and be very, very good specialists and professionals. So don't be afraid to have some changes.
No, it's exciting, and life does not follow a straightforward path. So just take the opportunities as they come, I think, on a slightly philosophical note. But we have one more late entry as a question, and I think the answer to this one is very much going to be yes, and it's from Virginie. It says, regarding regulations, the European Pharmacopoeia recognises as compendials sterility tests can take up to 14 days. Rapid and automated methods allowing shorter analysis times, reducing, hang on, I've lost my question. Shorter analysis times, reducing therefore production time and accelerating product availability are, however, still recognised as alternative, making their implementation more complicated. Do you think it's important to call for a revision of quality control standards, which currently constitute a regulatory barrier to the rapid release of health innovation in Europe? And I'll go for a rapid response from both Sarah and Inga. So perhaps, Inga, you still have your microphone on, so perhaps you would like to answer that question. And we're talking about the revision of quality control standards, which may be a barrier to innovation in Europe.
I think I cannot really answer this question because it's I'm not really familiar with quality control standards. Maybe Sarah.
Well, that's good. Sarah brings the same answer there, but I think it's really come out of the discussions we had this afternoon, where we're saying, yes, don't constrain the ability to innovate or the ability of that innovation to impact qualities and impact products that we can then take up. So I think this is a really good question and one that we will definitely follow up within the biomanufacturing platform. So that definitely brings us to the end of our webinar. So I would like to thank you once more, both Sarah, Inga and Gwenelle, for your really great inputs as part of our valued members of our industry advisory group. I would really like to thank Virginia for all of her work in bringing the recommendations together. And let's look ahead for the moment for the biomanufacturing platform. What do we have coming up? I said earlier that we are bringing our recommendations into action now, and this will really drive what we do within the platform to increase awareness and tie in specific requirements for biomanufacturing so that they are reflected and recognised within Europe's strategies and policies. But you can find us coming up, as well as on LinkedIn and in future webinars. You can find us at Bio in Boston. Can we just go back one slide? Thank you. You'll find us at Bio in Boston, where we are hosting a roundtable on biomanufacturing for health. And we would very much invite you to be with us at our EFIB 2023 conference in Rotterdam, where biomanufacturing will be a fundamental part of the agenda for our two-day conference there. So thank you once again. We'll move to our final slide and we will follow up with all participants so you can share the slides, see the recording, and see you again in our next biomanufacturing activity. Thank you very much, everybody, and I bring the webinar to a close.